"Can I sit with you?" my boss with one leg asked. I said yes, and everything changed after that. She wasn't a colleague. She wasn't someone passing through. She was my boss, the most untouchable woman in our building, and she was standing at my table, on one leg, one real, one prosthetic, holding a tray, a portfolio, and what I would later understand was the last piece of pride she had left that day. My name is Marcus Hale. I'm nobody in that building. A coordinator, a quiet desk, a name on a spreadsheet. But she is Diane Calloway, CEO. The woman 40 executives compete daily just to impress. The woman who walks into boardrooms and changes the temperature of the entire room without saying a single word. She never asks anyone for anything. But that Tuesday, every chair in that cafeteria was taken. And every person who saw her coming, people who smiled at her in elevators, people who laughed at her jokes in meetings, suddenly found somewhere else to look. Every single one of them. But not me. I said yes. I pulled out the chair, and everything changed after that. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that one simple yes to my boss with one leg would unravel the story she'd been hiding behind that authority, that blazer, and that unbreakable composure for 3 years straight. What breaks a woman that powerful? What did losing that leg really cost her, beyond what anyone in that building ever saw? And what could a grieving, invisible nobody possibly give his boss that her entire world of power, title, and success never could? I'd been eating alone for 8 months straight. Same corner table, same lukewarm coffee, same view of the city moving 14 floors below, like it had somewhere important to be, and I didn't. I wasn't angry about it. I was just empty. My mother had passed in February, pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to gone, and the version of me that used to laugh easily, talk freely, fill a room, he went with her. So I sat in corners. I wore earbuds I forgot to plug in. I watched the clock and waited for days to end. That Tuesday, the cafeteria was louder than usual. Some department luncheon had pushed everyone into the main floor, and the noise level was the kind that presses against your temples. I had my head down, poking at a sandwich I wasn't tasting when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tap cutting through the chaos. Steady, deliberate, unhurried. I looked up. She was navigating the crowded room like someone who had made peace with every obstacle life puts in a path. Her carbon fiber prosthetic visible below tailored slacks, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. One hand gripped a tray, the other held a leather portfolio pressed to her side like a shield, and she was moving through a sea of people who all, one by one, found reasons not to see her. A table of 4 with 2 empty chairs. A man shifted his bag without looking up. A woman suddenly became very interested in her phone. Diane Calloway, CEO of the company I'd worked at for 3 years, a woman whose name was on the building's directory in bold letters on the very first line, had nowhere to sit in her own building's cafeteria. She stopped at my table, looked at the empty chairs, then looked at me. No performance in her eyes, no softness asking for sympathy. Just a direct, quiet question from a woman who clearly hated that she had to ask it at all. "Can I sit with you?" I pulled out the chair. "Yeah, go ahead." She sat down, set her tray and portfolio down in one clean motion, and opened her documents like she hadn't just been invisibilized by an entire room of people who owed her their paychecks. Like it hadn't happened. Like she was completely fine. But her jaw was tight, and her hand, just for a second, pressed flat against the table like she needed to feel something solid. She wasn't fine, and somehow, in the part of me that grief had scraped raw and left open, I recognized that immediately. We didn't speak for a few minutes, just 2 people sharing a table. The cafeteria noise wrapped around us. My coffee had gone cold. Her food sat untouched. Then, without looking up from her papers, she said, "You're not actually listening to anything." I blinked. "Sorry?" She nodded at my earbuds. "The cord isn't plugged into anything." I looked down. She was right. I'd grabbed them off my desk by pure muscle memory and never connected them. 8 months of going through the motions had made me sloppy in ways I didn't even notice anymore. But she noticed. And for the first time in 8 months, I felt something shift. Something small and quiet, like a door in a dark house opening just a crack, letting in a single line of light. I looked at her. She looked at me, and neither of us looked away quite fast enough. She looked back down at her papers first, but the question just hung there between us, quiet and unexpected, like a note slipped under a door. I pulled the useless earbud out completely, set it on the table. Some small admission I didn't plan to make. Bad habit, I said. She glanced up briefly. Or bad few months. I paused. Both. She nodded once, the way someone nods when they already know the answer, but asked anyway, just to see if you'd be honest. Then she went back to her documents, and I went back to my sandwich. But the silence between us had changed. It wasn't the silence of two strangers tolerating each other anymore. It was something slightly warmer than that, slightly more deliberate. A minute passed, maybe two. Grief does that, she said quietly, still not looking up. Makes you go through all the right motions and forget to actually connect anything. I set my sandwich down slowly. That specific? Now she looked up, those gray-green eyes steady and unsentimental. That's specific. I don't know what made me say the next thing. Maybe it was the fact that she was a stranger. Maybe it was the fact that grief had burned away most of my social filters by that point. Maybe it was just that she'd said the truest thing anyone had said to me in 8 months without even trying. My mother, I said. February, 6 weeks. Something moved behind her eyes, not pity, not the rehearsed sympathy people perform when they don't know what else to do. The head tilt, the soft voice, the "I'm so sorry" that evaporates the second they walk away. This was different. This was recognition. The look of someone who has stood in the same dark room and knows exactly how low the ceiling feels. I'm sorry, she said, but the way she said it was quiet and direct, like she meant the words individually and not just as a phrase. Sudden loss is its own kind of violence. It doesn't ask permission. It just takes. I looked at her. Really looked. And for the first time I noticed the small things. The way her shoulders held a tension that had clearly lived there so long it had become structural. The way her eyes, sharp and commanding on the surface, carried something underneath that looked exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix. The leather portfolio she kept one hand resting on, like letting go of it completely, wasn't something she was ready to do. How long for you? I asked. She went still for just a second. A half-beat pause most people would have missed. 3 years, she said. Different kind of loss. But loss. I didn't push. She didn't elaborate. But the words settled between us like something real and heavy, and neither of us pretended they hadn't landed. We talked for the rest of the lunch hour. Properly this time. Not the careful, performance-level small talk of two people in an office building, but the kind of conversation that happens when two people are both too tired to pretend. She asked what I did. I gave her the honest version. Coordinator, spreadsheets, meetings about meetings. She smiled at that. Not a polished smile. A real one, quick and unguarded, gone almost before I could register it. I asked what she did. Operations, she said simply. Left it there. I didn't press. We talked about the city. About how Chicago in October smells like cold concrete and burnt coffee and something almost like hope if the wind is right. About a book we'd both apparently abandoned at the exact same chapter for the exact same reason. The author kept explaining things the reader had already felt. She laughed at that. Once, fully, her head tilting back slightly, and the sound of it cut right through the cafeteria noise, like it belonged to a different, lighter world than the one she'd walked in carrying. I felt something unfamiliar in my chest. Not attraction exactly. Not yet. Something quieter. The feeling of being briefly, unexpectedly, unalone. When the cafeteria started thinning out, she began gathering her things. Tray, portfolio. The small, invisible architecture of preparation she'd clearly perfected. The way she positioned herself before standing. The way she rose with a fluid steadiness that suggested hours of private practice no one was ever meant to witness. Thank you for the seat, she said. Thank you for the company, I replied, and I meant it in a way I hadn't meant anything in a long time. She gave me one last look, brief, assessing, with something in it I couldn't quite name. And then she walked back through the cafeteria, through the crowd that had thinned enough now to make it easier, and through the double doors without looking back. I sat there for a moment after she left. The corner of the cafeteria felt different, bigger somehow, quieter. I looked at my untouched coffee and unplugged earbuds and realized my sandwich was gone. I'd actually eaten it without noticing, somewhere in the middle of a real conversation, which I hadn't done in months. I didn't know her name. She didn't know mine. And I went back upstairs to my desk with something small but undeniable sitting in my chest, where the emptiness usually lived. That feeling lasted exactly 45 minutes. That's how long it took before my manager, Derek, knocked on my cubicle partition with the particular expression he reserved for delivering mildly catastrophic information as casually as possible. Hey, quick thing. Leadership wants all coordinators in the main conference room at 3. Callaway's doing a surprise operational review. He said it like it was nothing. Like that name should mean nothing to me beyond the standard voltage of professional anxiety it sent through the entire floor every time it was mentioned. Callaway, I repeated. Yeah, Diane Callaway, CEO. He was already walking away. Don't be late. She notices. I sat there for a moment, very still. Diane Callaway. I pulled up the company directory on my screen with the slow, slightly nauseated energy of a man who already knows what he's about to find, but needs to see it anyway. And there she was. Third line from the top. Diane Callaway, Chief Executive Officer. The small professional headshot beside the name showed a woman in a dark blazer, expression composed, eyes steady and gray-green, and absolutely unmistakable. The woman who had asked to sit with me. The woman who had noticed my unplugged earbuds. The woman who had laughed at my joke about the elevator. The woman who had said grief takes without asking permission and looked like she knew exactly what she was talking about. My boss. Not just my boss, the boss. The name on the first line of the building directory. The woman 40 executives straightened their ties for. She had sat at my table, in my corner, eating lukewarm cafeteria food and talking about abandoned books in October in Chicago. And she had never once told me who she was. I closed the directory, stared at my screen without seeing it, turned the whole thing over in my mind looking for the angle, the power move, the test, the strategic reason a CEO doesn't identify herself to a junior coordinator during a random cafeteria conversation. But the more I turned it over, the more I kept coming back to one thing. In the way she'd sat, the way she'd held her portfolio tightly and pressed her palm flat to the table for just a second after she sat down. The way she'd talked about loss not as a topic, but as a place she'd personally been to and never fully left. That wasn't performance. That wasn't strategy. That was a woman who for 40 minutes just wanted to be a person. Not a CEO, not a name in bold on a directory. Not the woman the entire building watches and whispers about and moves chairs away from without making it obvious. Just a person, sitting with another person, in a corner that nobody else wanted, and I had given her that without knowing I was giving it. At 3 o'clock, I walked into the main conference room with 17 other coordinators and found her already standing at the head of the table. Dark blazer, chief portfolio on the table in front of her, posture straight, expression exactly as composed and unreadable as a CEO's expression is supposed to be. She was already speaking when I came in, running through operational metrics with the quiet authority of someone who has never needed to raise her voice to be heard. Half the room was leaning forward slightly without realizing it. I took the last open seat near the back, kept my head down, opened my notebook. But about 4 minutes in the middle of a sentence about Q4 projections, Diane Callaway's eyes moved across the room in that slow, deliberate sweep of someone who sees everything, and stopped, directly on me. 1 second, maybe 2, no change in expression, not a flicker. She continued her sentence without missing a single word, her voice as steady as it had been before. But I saw it, that same brief assessing look from the cafeteria, the one I hadn't been able to name. And this time, I thought I understood it a little better. She knew exactly who I was. She had known the whole time. 3 days passed after that conference room moment. 3 days of me walking into work, sitting at my desk, doing my job, and trying very hard not to think about the fact that my CEO had eaten lukewarm cafeteria food in my corner. talked to me about grief like she lived inside it, and then looked at me across a conference room like she was recalculating something important. 3 days of telling myself it meant nothing. I was almost convincing myself too. The work week ended on a Friday that felt like every other Friday. Gray sky, cold wind off the lake, the building emptying floor by floor after 5 o'clock, like water draining from a tub. I stayed late, not for any particular reason. Staying late had become its own kind of habit since February. The apartment I went home to was quiet in a way that had teeth. And the office at least had the hum of computers and the distant sound of the cleaning crew to fill the space where noise was supposed to be. By 7:30, I was the last one on the 14th floor. I shut down my computer, pulled on my jacket, grabbed my bag, rode the elevator down alone, the one that takes exactly long enough to make every interaction inside it deeply uncomfortable, which is somehow worse when you're by yourself. Stepped out into the lobby, pushed through the heavy glass door into the cold October air, and stopped. She was sitting on the low concrete steps outside the building, not standing, not composed and portfolio ready. Sitting, her prosthetic leg extended slightly in front of her blazer traded for a dark coat that looked like she'd grabbed it in a hurry. No portfolio, no armor. Just Diane Calloway, and alone on the front steps of her own building at 7:30 on a Friday night, looking at the city like it owed her an explanation. She heard the door and looked up. For a second, neither of us moved. The wind came off the street cold and sharp, carrying the smell of rain somewhere close and the distant sound of the city doing what cities do. Indifferent, relentless, alive in the way that makes loneliness feel louder by contrast. "You stayed late," she said. "So did you," I replied. She looked back at the street. I stood there for a moment, and then, because it was the only thing that felt honest, I walked over and sat down beside her on the steps. Not close, not far, just beside her. The way she had done at my table 3 days ago. She didn't say anything about it, but something in her shoulders dropped a fraction. So small most people would have missed it. I didn't. We sat in silence for a while. The city moved in front of us. A cab honked somewhere. A couple walked past laughing, leaning into each other against the cold. The first drops of rain appeared on the pavement, dark spots spreading slowly on the gray concrete, like the sky was making up its mind. "I should have told you who I was," she said finally. Her voice was different out here, stripped of the conference room frequency, lower, more careful. "In the cafeteria," I said. "Yes." I thought about it honestly. "Would you have sat down if you'd introduced yourself first?" A pause. "No." "Then I'm glad you didn't." She turned and looked at me then. Really looked, the way she had across the conference room, but without the distance, without the professional glass between us. Up close, when in the gray evening light, she looked younger than she did in boardrooms, and more tired, and more real. "I used to eat in the executive dining room," she said. "Private, quiet, no one to navigate around." She said the last words with a precision that told me she was talking about more than furniture. 3 years ago, that changed, and I told myself I didn't care, that I'd adapted, that it didn't bother me when people— She stopped, started again. "When people found somewhere else to look." The rain was picking up slightly now. Neither of us moved. "But it bothers you," I said. Not a question. "It bothers me," she confirmed, quietly, like admitting it cost her something. "Not the leg. I made my peace with the leg. But the way people look at you differently afterward. The way someone who used to meet your eyes starts talking to a spot just above your shoulder. The way a room that used to feel like yours starts feeling like something you have to earn back every single day." She paused. "My fiancé left 4 months after the accident. Said he loved me but couldn't." Another stop. Shorter this time. He had a whole sentence prepared. I don't remember most of it. I just remember that he'd clearly practiced it. The rain was falling properly now, soft and steady, darkening the steps around us. I didn't rush to fill the silence. Some things need a moment to land before you speak after them. "The person I lost," I said eventually, "my mother, she used to say that the people who leave during the hard parts are doing you a kindness, showing you early what they're actually made of." I felt the familiar ache of her absence move through my chest, but softer tonight than it had been in months. Less like a wound, and more like a scar beginning to close. I didn't believe her when she said it. I think I'm starting to. Diane was quiet for a long moment. Then, she sounds like she was remarkable. She was the best person I ever knew, I said simply. And for the first time since February, saying it out loud didn't break me. It just made her feel present, close, like she was sitting on the steps with us in the rain, listening. Diane looked down at her hands. I stopped letting people sit close enough to see me, she said. After everything, it felt safer, cleaner. She exhaled slowly. But Tuesday, there were no seats, and I was tired. I was just so tired of standing in doorways waiting for the room to make space. Her voice dropped even lower. And you just said yes. No calculation. No, no slight hesitation while you decided whether it was worth it. You just said yes. I turned to look at her fully. The rain had darkened her hair slightly at the edges, and she hadn't moved to fix it, which told me something important about how much of her guard was down right now. This was not Diane Calloway, CEO. This was just Diane, sitting in the rain on her own front steps because something in her had needed to, and for once she'd let herself. I didn't know who you were, I said. I know. A small, complicated smile crossed her face. That was the whole point. We sat with that for a moment. The rain, the city, the space between us that had been quietly shrinking since Tuesday without either of us directing it. For what it's worth, I said, knowing who you are didn't change anything. If you came and sat at my table tomorrow, I'd pull out the chair. She looked at me. Something in her expression shifted. Not dramatically, not with the cinematic clarity of a movie moment, just quietly. The way a room looks different when someone finally opens the curtains. Like something that had been braced for a long time was gently, carefully, letting go. Marcus, she said softly. Yeah, thank you for the chair. And I understood she wasn't talking about Tuesday anymore. The rain fell around us steady and clean. We stayed on those steps a while longer, talking the way people talk when they've stopped performing for each other. About her mother, Timum, who had built the company and left it to a daughter who'd spent years trying to be worthy of the wait. About my plans, small and honest. About what it felt like to be rebuilding yourself when you weren't entirely sure what the original version was supposed to look like. About nothing important. About everything that was. When we finally stood to leave, she didn't reach for her portfolio because she hadn't brought it. She just pulled her coat a little tighter and looked at me with those gray-green eyes that I now knew held a whole history the conference room never showed. Same time Tuesday, she said. And there was something in the way she said it, careful, genuine, almost shy, that had nothing to do with the cafeteria and everything to do with what we just handed each other on those rain-soaked steps. I smiled, and it was the first full smile I'd worn since February. I could feel the difference. Same time Tuesday, she nodded once. Then she walked to her car, steady and unhurried, a woman who had spent 3 years rebuilding herself in private and had just, for the first time, let someone watch. I stood there in the rain a moment longer. The city hummed. The streetlights caught the water on the pavement and turned it gold. And I thought about what my mother used to say, that the moments that change your life rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive with thunder or fanfare or a sign above the door. They arrive quietly, as an empty chair, as a simple question, as 4 words spoken carefully by a woman with one leg, nowhere to sit, and more courage in her exhaustion than most people carry at their best. Can I sit with you? Yes. Always yes. If this story moved you the way it moved me telling it, please subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Every single week, we bring you real, raw, human stories that remind you what people are actually made of when life strips everything else away. Don't let the algorithm bury the next one. Subscribe. Turn on the bell. Be here for it. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it honestly. Has there ever been a moment in your life when you were the one standing in that crowded room, invisible, and somebody simply said yes, and that one word quietly changed everything? Tell me in the comments. Your story matters more than you know.